Okay, so what we're going to do is we want to look at section 5.4 and 5.5. And here we want to translate arguments. So we're going to use concepts from section 1.1, chapter 4, some things from chapter 5, and we're going to begin piling all these together. Okay, and so we talked about it throughout the semester, and so now we're going to see some of this stack up on one another. So what we have to do is we have to reduce terms. And in doing that, what we do is we find our conclusion, we find our premise, we get rid of all the nons that would be in our statement, and then we would put it in standard form. And so what we want to do is we want to look at how all this functions, and so we'll go by it step by step. So step number 1, find the conclusion, the premise. I'm going to encourage you to go back to page 3 in your textbook. In there you have indicator words for premises, and you have indicator words for conclusion. Those will come into play and be important as we go through chapter 5, the remainder of chapter 5. So keep that in mind. Okay. The second thing we do is we get rid of the nons. So once again, just a quick review. Conversion works on E and I statements. And sometimes we need to convert in order to get the non into the predicate position if we want to use obversion to get rid of a non. So, but once again, remember it must apply to an E and an I statement only. Obversion deals with the all 4 statements, and what we need to do there is remember that if we can get the non into the predicate, so any non-term with the word non in front of it, non-B, non-A, what we want to do is get that to the predicate, and then we can use obversion on any type of statement, A, E, I, and O, in order to remove the non. Okay. The third thing we can do is we can use contraposition, which switches the subject and the predicate, and then we give both the non-term or both the term complements. So if it's a non, we take the non away. Okay. Now remember that contraposition only works on an A and an O statement. And then what we do is we put it into standard form. So the thing we have to remember is that step 2 may change the subject and predicate of the conclusion. So this is why we do standard form last. Okay, so do it last. Okay, so let's look at an example here. All aircraft that disintegrate in flight are unsafe planes. Therefore, no poorly maintained aircraft are safe planes, because all well-maintained aircraft are aircraft that remain intact in flight. So the first thing we do, and we've talked about this multiple times throughout the semester, is we find the conclusion. This one's kind of easy because the word therefore kind of gives it away. Therefore, and so we know that our conclusion is now no poorly maintained aircraft are safe planes. So we're going to call that no P are S. Okay, and so you can see that right down here where no P are S. Our first premise then is going to be that all aircraft that disintegrate in flight are unsafe planes. Okay, so we've not used a phrase regarding aircraft that disintegrate in flight, so we're going to call that A. But we have talked about safe planes, so therefore an unsafe plane would be a non-S. So our first premise will be all A are non-S. The second premise that we're going to come to is we're going to talk about all well-maintained aircraft are aircraft that remain intact. Now we have up here poorly maintained aircraft, so we're going to find that all well-maintained aircraft would be the opposite, the term complement. So all well-maintained aircraft are all non-P, because we've already used P here. Aircraft that remain intact in flight would be the opposite, or the term complement of aircraft that disintegrate in flight. So we've already used aircraft that disintegrate in flight as A, so then aircraft that remain intact would be non-A's. So when we put it all together, our syllogism says all A are non-S, premise 1. Premise 2, all non-P are non-A. Conclusion, no P are S. Now we're okay. First of all, the conclusion has no nons. That makes life easy. And then we consider each premise separately. Okay, now first thing I want to do is I want to look at it and say, is the minor term is the major term in the major premise? And the answer to that obviously would be yes. S is the major term, and it is found in the major premise. P is the minor term, and we find it in the minor premise. So my major term, major premise. Minor term, minor premise. So let's look at each one separately. With the non and the predicate, all A are non-S. Okay, what do we use? Obviously, it tells you here we use aversion, and we know that aversion works on all statements. So therefore, when we do aversion, what do? Rule number 1 to an aversion is we change quality. So it goes from an affirmative to a negative, or a negative to an affirmative. All is an affirmative statement, so we've got to go to a negative statement. So, and it must remain universal. So a universal all statement that's affirmative becomes a universal no statement that's negative. So the first thing we do is we change the all to no. With the subject, we leave it the same, and with the predicate, we give it a term complement. So non-S becomes S. So now we've rewritten our syllogism that says no A are S. Our statement. Now we have all non-P are non-A. We know that this is a statement, and we know that contraposition will work on an A statement. So when contraposition, we switch predicate and subject, so the non-P becomes the predicate and non-A becomes the subject. And then with contraposition, we give it term complements. So now when we switched it, give it term complements, non-A becomes A, non-P becomes P, and the predicate moves to the subject. So all A are P. So that now becomes our second premise. Okay, so our syllogism now looks like this. No A are S, all A are P, no P are S. Okay, so is it in standard form? So the first question I ask is the predicate of the conclusion in the first premise. No PRS, let's see. S is our predicate of our conclusion, our major term, and it is in the first premise, which is our major premise. So now we know that it is in standard form. Okay, so we're done with that. If we're done, we leave it. If we're not, we would switch to two premises. So if the S were actually in the minor premise here, we would just switch these two. But it's okay now, so we're going to leave it. We look at this, we say this is an EAE statement. And we know that it's a figure 3 because it deals with the middle term. And the middle term is in the subject position, vertically in the subject. So in both premises, it's in the subject, so we know that's figure 3. So if we go back to page 262, I believe it is, yes, 262 in the textbook, we're going to look for an EAE figure 2, EAE figure 2, so we find it right here, okay, and so according to this, it's unconditionally valid. So if we go back to our thing, we look at it, and we say, well, wait a minute, it's invalid illicit minor. What do I have to do? Let's go back to section 5.3 and let's look at the rules in section 5.3. So in 5.3 on page, and of course I have it out of order, which works that way for me sometimes. Let's look at page 281 in our textbook. So once again, we have to confirm things. Now that we know more rules, we have to confirm a lot of things. So what we have here is we have an issue. Okay, so if we go back to this, what we find, we find that's invalid. It has an illicit minor, and the reason is, what does an invalid illicit minor say? It says if a term is distributed in the conclusion, then it must be distributed in the premise. So let's go back and let's look at what's distributed in this PowerPoint. Okay, so if a term is distributed, so once again now you might want to go to page 204, and I'm not going to pull it up on the screen, but I have my textbook here. So let's go to page 204. In page 204, what do we have? Looking at the rule again in the textbook, it says that if a term is distributed in the conclusion, and what kind of a conclusion do we have? We have an E statement as a conclusion. What's distributed in the conclusion? Both S and P are distributed. And so what we do is we look up here and we say, is S distributed? So here we know that S is distributed, okay, here. And in the an all statement, we know that P is distributed. And in this statement, it is not distributed, so therefore we know that even though it would tell us it would be conditionally valid based on mood and figure, we find that the rule tells us, even though that may be true, it is untrue, it's invalid because this has performed an illicit minor. So you've got to remember what we're talking about when we deal with each one of these ideas. Okay, so hopefully you grasp that. If you have any questions, like I say, bring them to class and we'll talk about them in class. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually stop this recording. I'm going to start another one just because I want to make sure we cover all of the information necessary for 5.5.